The Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime had never witnessed such chaos.
Representatives from 12 major species shouted over each other in 17 different languages, their translators struggling to keep up with the rapid-fire accusations and demands. At the center of it all sat Ambassador Chenwei, the sole human representative, calmly sipping tea from a simple ceramic cup while the galaxy's most powerful beings lost their collective minds. "This is preposterous," screeched Chancellor Vexthera, her crystalline body flashing angry red patterns.
The Selenite leader's voice cut through the din like broken glass. "These primitives have been in space for less than 2 centuries, and now they dare make demands of us?"
The Corvan delegate, a massive bear-like creature named Gorthak, slammed his fist on the metal table. "They've disrupted trade routes across 3 sectors. My people's merchant fleets are reporting massive losses because of their audacious interference."
Ambassador Chen took another sip of his tea and set the cup down with a soft clink.
The sound somehow carried across the vast chamber, causing a momentary lull in the shouting. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. "Honorable delegates," Chen began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding."
"Misunderstanding?" The Zephyrian representative, a floating mass of bioluminescent tentacles, pulsed with indignant colors. "Your species has systematically undermined the established order of this galaxy. You've turned entire systems against their rightful overlords." Shin smiled, the expression somehow both gentle and terrifying. "We simply offered them a choice."
The chaos that erupted made the previous shouting match seem like a whisper. Security drones hummed to life around the chamber's perimeter, their weapons systems powering up with ominous whines. But Chen remained perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. The story had begun 3 years earlier, when humanity's first diplomatic mission encountered the Corvan hegemony. The humans had been exploring the outer rim of their local spiral arm when they stumbled upon a Corvan mining operation on the planet Kepler 442b. What they found there changed everything. Captain Sarah Martinez had been leading the exploration mission aboard the UES Prometheus when they detected the massive industrial complex on the planet's surface. Initial scans showed a thriving ecosystem being systematically stripped away, with millions of the planet's native Keplers, small, blue-furred humanoids with large, intelligent eyes, working in conditions that could only be described as slavery.
The Corvans had been polite enough when the humans first made contact.
Trade negotiations began smoothly, with the bear-like aliens offering rare minerals in exchange for human technology. It was only when Captain Martinez asked about the working conditions on the planet that things took a dark turn. "The Keplers are our property," Overlord Bruthax had explained through the translator, his tone suggesting he was discussing livestock. "They were a primitive species when we arrived. We civilized them, gave them purpose. In return, they serve." Martinez had maintained her diplomatic composure, but her crew could see the ice forming in her blue eyes.
"I see. And what happens if they choose not to serve?" Bruthax had laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Choose?"
They are incapable of such concepts. They are fed, housed, and protected.
What more could primitives want?
The human delegation had left that day with polite farewells and promises to consider the trade agreement. What the Corvans didn't know was that Martinez had left behind a small reconnaissance team led by Sergeant Mike Torres, one of humanity's most decorated Special Forces operators. Torres and his team spent 3 weeks observing the Corvan operations.
What they documented painted a picture of systematic oppression that made humanity's own dark history look tame by comparison.
The Keplers were intelligent, emotional beings with complex social structures and rich cultural traditions.
They had been conquered, not civilized, and those who resisted faced brutal punishment.
The turning point came when Torres witnessed a Kepler child, no more than 6 years old, being beaten unconscious for dropping a container of ore. The child's mother, shackled to prevent her from helping, could only watch and weep as her offspring was dragged away.
That night, Torres made a decision that would reshape galactic politics forever. He approached the Kepler resistance leaders in the mining camps.
"We're humans," he had whispered in the darkness, using a translation device to speak their language.
"And we'd like to help you become free."
The Kepler elder, an ancient female named Kiera with scars covering her blue fur, had looked at him with eyes that held both hope and suspicion.
"Why would strangers help us?" What do you want in return?
Torres had smiled grimly.
Nothing.
Where we come from, we have a saying, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing.
We've learned that lesson the hard way. Within weeks, human advisors were secretly training Kepler resistance fighters.
They taught them about guerrilla warfare, but, more importantly, they taught them about human concepts like civil disobedience, organized labor strikes, and peaceful resistance.
The humans didn't just give them weapons, they gave them ideas.
The Corvan hegemony first noticed something was wrong when productivity in their mines began dropping.
At first, they assumed it was equipment failure or worker fatigue.
They responded with the usual solution, increased punishment and longer work hours. But the Keplers had learned new tactics from their human advisors. When the Corvans increased punishment, the workers didn't cower, they sang. Ancient Kepler songs of resistance echoed through the mines, growing louder with each lash of the whip. When work hours were extended, the entire workforce would simultaneously slow their pace, making the same amount of work take twice as long. The final straw came when the Keplers organized what humans called a general strike.
Every worker on every mining platform simply stopped working and sat down.
They didn't fight back when the Corvan overseers arrived with weapons. They just sat there, looking up at their oppressors with quiet dignity, singing softly in their native tongue. Overlord Bruthax had been furious when he arrived at the main mining platform to find thousands of Keplers sitting peacefully in formation while his overseers stood around helplessly. The songs echoing across the landscape were hauntingly beautiful, and, somehow, they made the heavily armed Corvans seem like the small ones.
Get up! Bruthax roared, his massive frame towering over the nearest Kepler. Get back to work!
The Kepler, a young female named Neela, looked up at him with calm eyes.
No, she said in accented but clear Corvan. We choose not to. That single word, choose, sent ripples through the Corvan ranks. It wasn't supposed to be in the Kepler vocabulary. Bruthax raised his weapon, intending to make an example of the defiant Kepler.
But, as he did, something unprecedented happened. Every single Kepler on the platform stood up simultaneously and linked arms, creating an unbroken chain of blue-furred bodies surrounding their comrade. The Corvans found themselves facing not one defiant slave, but thousands of unified beings who had suddenly remembered they were people. That was when Captain Martinez's fleet appeared in orbit. The humans had been monitoring the situation, waiting for exactly this moment.
Martinez opened communications with the Corvan fleet, her transmission reaching every ship in the system.
This is Captain Sarah Martinez of the United Earth Space Forces, her voice rang out across all frequencies. We're here to ensure the safety of the Kepler people during their transition to self-governance.
Bruthax's response came in the form of weapons fire.
Corvan battlecruisers opened up with everything they had, their plasma cannons lighting up space with deadly energy.
What happened next became the stuff of legend across the galaxy. The human fleet didn't return fire immediately. Instead, they simply vanished.
One moment they were there, the next they had disappeared completely from all sensors. Corvan gunners found themselves firing at empty space while trying to figure out where an entire fleet had gone. The humans had been developing stealth technology based on principles their scientists barely understood, borrowed from studies of quantum mechanics and theoretical physics. While other species had focused on bigger guns and stronger shields, humanity had chosen a different path: invisibility. The Corvan fleet spent precious minutes searching for targets that weren't there, burning fuel and ammunition while their enemies moved like ghosts through space. When the humans finally revealed themselves, they did so all at once, appearing simultaneously around every Corvan ship with weapons already locked on target.
But, instead of firing, Martinez did something that confused every military analyst in the galaxy: she surrendered.
This is Captain Martinez, her voice came over open channels. I'm ordering my fleet to power down weapons and prepare for capture. The Corvan hegemony has clearly demonstrated superior firepower.
Bruthax couldn't believe his luck. These strange aliens had just handed him the greatest victory in Corvan history.
He would return to the homeworld with captured human technology and living specimens to study. It wasn't until his boarding parties reached the human ships that Bruthax realized he had been played. Every human vessel was completely empty except for a single crew member on each bridge. And those crew members weren't prisoners, they were volunteers who had stayed behind to deliver a message.
Commander Lisa Park stood alone on the bridge of the UES Defiance as Corvan Marines stormed in.
She smiled pleasantly at the heavily armed aliens and gestured to a large holographic display that had just activated. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I'd like you to meet the Kepler Liberation Network."
The display showed a three-dimensional map of the entire Corvan hegemony.
Hundreds of worlds lit up in blue as the Corvans watched in growing horror. Each light represented a planet where the native species had just received a transmission from the freed Keplers, along with detailed instructions on human resistance tactics. "What you're seeing," Park explained conversationally, "is the end of your empire. Every species you've enslaved, every world you've conquered, every being you've oppressed, they're all learning that they have a choice." Bruthax raised his weapon, but Park just smiled.
"Oh, and, Overlord? You might want to check your homeworld."
The tactical display shifted to show the Corvan capital system. Where the planet's defensive grid should have been, there was nothing but empty space. The massive orbital weapons platforms that protected their world had simply vanished.
"My people are very good at being invisible," Park said. "We've been studying your defenses for weeks.
Right now, a single human ship is sitting in orbit around your homeworld with enough firepower to crack the crust. But don't worry, we won't use it.
We're not conquerors." She paused, letting that sink in.
"We're liberators." The Corvan hegemony collapsed within 6 months. Not through military conquest or violent revolution, but through the simple act of giving oppressed peoples the tools to free themselves. Species after species rose up, not with weapons, but with the quiet dignity of beings who had remembered their worth.
The Selenite Republic was next.
The crystalline beings had built their empire on a foundation of genetic supremacy, claiming that their silicon-based biology made them inherently superior to carbon-based life forms. They had spent millennia conquering and uplifting lesser species, forcing them into rigid caste systems where their genetic heritage determined their role in society. The humans approached the Selenite situation differently. Instead of supporting violent resistance, they focused on education and cultural exchange. Human teachers and philosophers arrived on Selenite worlds as cultural observers, sharing stories of Earth's history and the human struggle for equality. The messages were subtle but powerful. They told stories of humans who had been enslaved and fought for freedom, of women who had been denied equality and changed the world, of common people who had stood up to tyrants and won through unity and determination. The Selenites' client species began to ask uncomfortable questions.
Why did genetic heritage matter more than individual merit? Why were some lives valued less than others? Why should anyone accept oppression simply because of the circumstances of their birth?
When the Selenite Republic tried to suppress these questions with force, they discovered that their client species had learned human tactics of nonviolent resistance.
Entire worlds went on strike.
Scientists and engineers refused to work on military projects.
Even Selenite citizens began questioning their own system.
Chancellor Vexthera's government fell not to invasion but to the simple realization that their empire was built on a lie that no one believed anymore. One by one, the galaxy's great powers found themselves facing the same inexorable force, the idea that all sentient beings deserved freedom and dignity.
The humans didn't conquer through superior technology or military might.
They conquered through something far more powerful, the belief that a better world was possible. Now, as Ambassador Chen stood in the Galactic Council chambers surrounded by the furious representatives of collapsing empires, he embodied that quiet revolution.
"You want to know what humanity's secret is?" Chen asked the assembled delegates. "It's simple.
We believe that everyone, regardless of species, origin, or biology, has the right to choose their own destiny." The Zephyrian delegates' tentacles writhed with agitation.
"Your naive idealism will destroy the order we've spent millennia building." Chen's smile grew wider.
"No," he said softly. "It will replace it with something better." Outside the council chambers, across thousands of worlds, millions of beings who had never known freedom were learning that they could stand up, speak out, and choose their own path forward.
The galaxy would never be the same.
And, in the depths of space, invisible human ships continued their quiet work, carrying the most dangerous cargo in the universe, hope.
The emergency session of the Galactic Security Council convened in absolute secrecy aboard the massive dreadnought Eternal Dominion. Representatives from the remaining major powers, the Hegemony Alliance, the Corporate Syndicate, and the Void Hunters, had gathered to address what they now called the human problem. Fleet Admiral Krekstar of the Hegemony Alliance stood at the head of the briefing table, his forearms gesturing at holographic displays showing the current state of galactic politics. Red zones marked former territories now in open rebellion, while yellow areas indicated regions where human cultural advisors had been detected. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," Krekstar announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had conquered 17 star systems. "The humans have weaponized something we never considered a threat: compassion." Around the table, the most feared military minds in the galaxy shifted uncomfortably. These were beings who had built their reputations on conquest, domination, and the absolute certainty that might made right. The idea that they were being defeated by kindness was almost incomprehensible. Corporate executive Zilax, whose cybernetic implants covered half his face with glowing red circuitry, pulled up profit reports on his personal display. "The economic damage is catastrophic. Labor disputes have spread across 47 sectors. Entire species are refusing to work under our employment contracts." "Employment contracts," scoffed Void Hunter Prime Nixera, her scarred face twisting into a grimace. "You mean slavery with paperwork? Perhaps if you hadn't treated sentient beings like disposable resources, they wouldn't be so eager to listen to human propaganda." Zilax's cybernetic eye flared. Easy words from someone whose people survive by raiding civilian vessels. "At least we provide structure and order." "Enough." Krekstar slammed his primary fist on the table. "Fighting among ourselves is exactly what the humans want. They've studied our histories, our weaknesses, our fears. They know how to turn us against each other." The Alliance leader activated a new holographic display showing intercepted human communications. The data streams were heavily encrypted, but their intelligence services had managed to decode fragments. "This is what we're facing," Krekstar continued. "The humans call it Operation Ripple Effect. They're not trying to conquer us militarily. They're trying to transform us from within." The fragments painted a disturbing picture. Human operatives weren't spreading weapons or military technology. Instead, they were distributing something far more dangerous: stories. Every human agent carried with them tales of Earth's history. They spoke of ordinary people who had changed the world through determination and sacrifice. They told of slaves who became free, of the oppressed who became leaders, of civilizations that had learned to value cooperation over conquest. But, more than that, they were teaching practical skills. Negotiation techniques, peaceful protest methods, organizational strategies for workers' rights, democratic decision-making processes, all the tools needed for oppressed populations to free themselves without violence. "The most insidious part," Krekstar explained, "is that they're not lying. These stories are all true. The humans actually lived through these transformations." Corporate executive Zilax leaned forward. "Then, we use their own history against them. Show their former slaves, their wars, their failures. Prove that their system doesn't work." "We've tried that," Admiral Krekstar replied grimly. "It backfires. When we show them human slavery, they respond with stories of abolition. When we show them human wars, they explain how they learned to build peace. When we demonstrate their failures, they discuss how failure taught them to do better." Void Hunter Prime Nixera had been silent throughout the briefing, but now she spoke up. "Then, we kill them all." The suggestion hung in the air like toxic gas. It was the obvious solution, the one they had all been thinking, but none had dared voice. "We've considered that option," Krekstar said slowly. "But there are problems. First, we can't find them all. Their stealth technology makes our sensors useless. Second, the humans have made themselves indispensable to the liberation movements. If we attack them directly, we make them martyrs. But, most importantly," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we're not sure we can win." The statement was shocking in its honesty. The three major powers still commanded massive fleets, controlled advanced technology, and had centuries of military experience. Yet none of them felt confident about facing humanity in open warfare. Explain, Nixera demanded.
Kregstar activated another display, this one showing tactical analyses of the few direct confrontations with human forces. The data was unsettling.
The humans fight differently than anyone we've encountered. They don't rely on superior technology or overwhelming force.
Instead, they use deception, misdirection, and psychological warfare with a skill level we've never seen. He highlighted the Battle of Kepler 442b, where a single human fleet had convinced an entire Corvan armada to surrender without firing a shot. They made the Corvans believe they were winning, then revealed that their victory was meaningless. The Corvans found themselves holding empty ships while the real human force completed their mission elsewhere.
The pattern repeated across multiple engagements. Human forces would appear to retreat, only to reappear behind enemy lines.
They would surrender entire fleets, then reveal that the surrendering ships were decoys while the real vessels completed their objectives. They fought like ghosts, always striking where they weren't expected and vanishing before retaliation was possible. But their real weapon, Kregstar continued, isn't military.
It's psychological. They make us question ourselves. Corporate executive Zilax scoffed. Impossible. Our training programs eliminate such weaknesses. Do they?
Kregstar challenged. 3 days ago, I received a report from one of my sector commanders. He was interrogating a captured human operative who had been organizing labor strikes on Nexus 7.
Do you know what the human said to him?
Kregstar paused for effect. She asked him if he was proud of what he had accomplished. Not his military victories or conquered territories. She asked if he was proud to be the kind of person who terrorized civilians to maintain order.
And? Nixera prompted.
He let her go, Kregstar admitted. A decorated military commander with 40 years of service released a prisoner because a human made him question his life choices. The silence in the room was deafening. These were the galaxy's most ruthless leaders, beings who had built their power on the certainty that they were superior to their subjects.
The idea that their own commanders might be vulnerable to human influence was terrifying. It was Zilax who broke the silence. Then, we changed the game.
If they want to fight with words and ideas, we'll give them a war of propaganda. The corporate syndicate had resources that dwarfed even the military powers. They controlled the galaxy's media networks, entertainment industries, and information systems. If anyone could counter human psychological warfare, it would be them.
We flood the networks with counter-narratives, Zilax explained. Show the chaos that follows their liberation movements.
Highlight the economic instability, the social disorder, the violence that inevitably erupts when established order breaks down.
Admiral Kregstar nodded slowly. Practical. What do you need?
Complete access to your intelligence networks, Zilax replied.
Every piece of information about human psychology, their weaknesses, their fears.
We'll craft messages specifically designed to undermine their influence. Within days, the corporate syndicate's propaganda machine went into full operation. News broadcasts across the galaxy began highlighting the negative consequences of the recent liberation movements. Stories focused on economic disruption, social unrest, and the suffering of ordinary citizens caught in the chaos of change. The messages were carefully crafted to exploit psychological vulnerabilities. They emphasized fear of the unknown, the comfort of familiar authority, and the dangers of trusting outsiders. Professional psychologists and social engineers worked around the clock to create content designed to break human influence over liberated populations. For a brief moment, it seemed to be working. Some worlds began questioning whether the human-inspired changes were worth the temporary chaos they created. Support for liberation movements wavered as populations were bombarded with images of disorder and uncertainty. But, then, something unexpected happened. Dr. Sarah Chen, a human xenopsychologist working on the planet New Haven, did something that changed everything. Instead of hiding from the propaganda war or fighting it with counter-messages, she did something completely different. She agreed with it. Standing before a crowd of recently liberated Ketheri, a reptilian species that had just thrown off corporate syndicate control, Dr. Chen nodded seriously as she addressed their concerns about the propaganda they had been seeing.
Everything you've heard is true, she said simply. Freedom is messy. Democracy is chaotic. Self-governance is hard work that never ends.
The crowd shifted nervously. This wasn't what they had expected from a human advisor. Change is painful, Dr. Chen continued.
Breaking chains hurts.
Learning to walk after generations of crawling is difficult and frightening. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. She paused, letting her words sink in.
But, here's the question you need to ask yourselves: who benefits when you're afraid of difficulty?
The simple question cut through months of propaganda like a laser through tissue paper. The Kethari began looking at the messages they had been receiving with new eyes. Every image of chaos, every story of economic disruption, every warning about the dangers of change, they all served the interests of those who wanted to maintain control. The people who want to keep you in chains will always tell you that freedom is too dangerous, too difficult, too costly, Dr. Chen explained. They'll show you every failure, every setback, every moment of pain that comes with growth. What they won't show you is what you can become. Within hours, similar conversations were taking place on dozens of worlds. Human advisors weren't fighting the propaganda campaign, they were using it as a teaching tool, helping liberated populations understand how information could be weaponized against them. The corporate syndicate's carefully crafted psychological warfare campaign backfired spectacularly. Instead of undermining human influence, it demonstrated exactly the kind of manipulation that the liberation movements were fighting against. Xelax watched his propaganda networks lose credibility across the galaxy as former subjects learned to recognize and reject manipulative messaging. Worse, his own employees were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about their role in the corporate power structure. The breaking point came when Dr. Elena Rodriguez, one of humanity's most skilled negotiators, requested a private meeting with the Galactic Security Council. The meeting took place in the same secure location where the three powers had planned their propaganda campaign. But, now, instead of planning humanity's defeat, they found themselves facing a small, unassuming woman who somehow made the most powerful beings in the galaxy feel like children who had been caught misbehaving. "Gentlemen," Dr. Rodriguez began, settling into her chair with casual confidence, "let's discuss terms."
Admiral Krekstar bristled. "Terms? You're in no position to dictate anything to us."
Dr. Rodriguez smiled politely.
"Actually, I am. Would you like to know why?"
Without waiting for an answer, she activated her personal display.
A holographic projection showed real-time status reports from across the galaxy.
The scope was breathtaking. Human intelligence networks had penetrated every major power center, monitoring everything from fleet movements to private communications. "We know where every one of your ships is located," she said conversationally.
"We have detailed analyses of your economic vulnerabilities. We understand your military doctrines better than your own strategists do.
And, most importantly, we've been having very interesting conversations with your own people." The display shifted to show transmission logs, thousands of them. Communications between human agents and members of the three major powers' own military and corporate hierarchies. "It turns out," Dr. Rodriguez continued, "that many of your soldiers and administrators have been asking the same questions we've been teaching oppressed populations to ask.
Questions like, why am I fighting? Who benefits from this system? Is there a better way?" Admiral Krekstar felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Mutiny? Enlightenment, Dr."
Rodriguez corrected gently.
"The same process we've used everywhere else. We don't conquer through force or deception. We simply help people realize they have choices."
She gestured to the display, where more data streams appeared. Personnel reports, psychological evaluations, resignation letters, a massive wave of military and corporate employees who were walking away from their positions. "Your fleets are experiencing unprecedented levels of desertion. Your corporations are losing key personnel at a rate that threatens basic operations. Your governments are struggling with widespread civil disobedience among their own bureaucrats."
Void Hunter Prime Nixera leaned forward aggressively. "And, you think this gives you some kind of victory?"
Dr. Rodriguez met her gaze calmly.
"I think it gives us an opportunity to build something better."
She stood and moved to the center of the room, her presence somehow commanding despite her small stature. "We're not here to replace your empires with human rule.
We're here to help everyone build societies based on cooperation rather than domination. The question is, are you ready to be part of that future, or do you want to go down with the old system? The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. But, accepting it meant abandoning everything these leaders had built their identities around. Corporate executive Zilax was the first to break. What would that look like? Dr. Rodriguez smiled, and, for the first time, it was genuinely warm. It looks like the hardest work you've ever done. It means learning to see your subjects as partners instead of resources. It means building systems based on consent rather than control. It means admitting that you've been wrong about some very fundamental things. She paused, studying their faces. But, it also means being part of something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that values every sentient being's right to freedom and dignity. Admiral Kregstar found himself asking a question he had never thought he would voice. And, if we refuse? Dr. Rodriguez's expression grew sad but determined. Then, you'll discover that an empire built on oppression can't survive when its foundation collapses. Your choice isn't whether to change, it's whether to be part of building what comes next. The galaxy's most powerful leaders sat in silence, contemplating a future they had never imagined. Outside their secure meeting room, across thousands of worlds, millions of beings were already building that future without them. The age of galactic empires was ending. What would rise in its place remained to be seen. 5 years after Dr. Elena Rodriguez's historic meeting with the Galactic Security Council, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The transformation hadn't come through war or conquest, but, through something far more profound, the quiet revolution of ordinary beings discovering their own worth. Captain James Park stood on the observation deck of the UES New Horizon, watching as construction crews from 17 different species worked together to build humanity's most ambitious project yet. The Galactic Cooperation Station would serve as a neutral meeting ground where the galaxy's new democratic governments could work together on shared challenges. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" came a familiar voice behind him. Park turned to see Dr. Elena Rodriguez approaching, now wearing the simple robes of her new position as Director of Interspecies Relations. Her hair had gone gray during the intensive years of negotiation and rebuilding that followed the collapse of the old empires. "I never thought I'd see anything like it," Park admitted, gesturing toward the construction site where former enemies worked side by side. A Corvan engineer taking design suggestions from a Kepler worker. A Selenite supervisor consulting with her Zephyrian crew chiefs. It's like watching a miracle happen in real time. Rodriguez smiled, but Park could see the exhaustion behind her eyes. The transition hadn't been easy for anyone, especially the humans who had found themselves reluctantly cast as teachers and mediators for an entire galaxy learning to govern itself. "Sometimes I wonder if we bit off more than we could chew," she confessed. "When we first started this, we just wanted to help the Keplers. We never imagined it would spread so far." "Second thoughts?" Park asked. "Daily," Rodriguez replied. "But, then, I remember what the alternative looked like." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the work continue outside. The station was more than just a meeting place, it was a symbol of what could be accomplished when beings worked together instead of trying to dominate each other. The transformation hadn't been without its growing pains. When the Corvan hegemony finally collapsed, 17 different species suddenly found themselves free but without any experience in self-governance. The humans had found themselves dealing with everything from resource disputes to cultural conflicts as former slave species tried to figure out how to live as neighbors instead of subjects. The corporate syndicate's fall had been even more chaotic. Thousands of worlds accustomed to centralized economic planning suddenly faced the challenge of building their own trade relationships and financial systems. The humans had to become crash course economics teachers, helping entire civilizations understand concepts like fair trade, workers' rights, and sustainable development. Even the Void Hunters' dissolution had created unexpected problems. Many of their former raiders had known no other way of life and struggled to find purpose in a galaxy that no longer rewarded predatory behavior. Rehabilitation programs led by human psychologists were still helping former pirates learn to contribute constructively to galactic society. Director Rodriguez came a voice over the ship's communication system. "We're receiving an urgent transmission from the Helix sector. It's Admiral Crextar. Rodriguez sighed.
Even 5 years later, some of the old guard still struggled with the new reality.
Put him through to conference room 3, she instructed. Captain Park, would you mind joining me? Crextar responds better when there's a military presence in the room.
They made their way through the ship's corridors, passing humans working alongside beings from across the galaxy. The New Horizon had become a floating embassy, carrying diplomatic teams to trouble spots where the new democratic governments needed guidance or mediation. In Conference Room 3, Admiral Crextar's imposing figure filled the holographic display. The former hegemony leader had aged considerably since their last meeting, his forearms moving with less of the aggressive confidence that had once made him the galaxy's most feared military commander.
Director Rodriguez, he began formally,
I need human assistance. Rodriguez settled into her chair, noting the uncomfortable way Crextar avoided eye contact.
What's the situation, Admiral? The Helix Defense Compact is facing internal disputes. 3 member worlds are threatening to withdraw over mining rights in the Vega system.
Traditional arbitration methods have failed, and tensions are escalating toward possible military action.
Park raised an eyebrow.
The Helix Defense Compact was one of the new regional alliances that had formed after the hegemony's collapse. For it to be requesting human mediation was significant. It meant the former slaves had learned to see their former masters as equals in need of help.
What kind of assistance are you requesting? Rodriguez asked.
Crextar's expression grew even more uncomfortable.
We need someone to teach us how to compromise. The word came out like he was choking on it.
For a being raised in a culture that viewed compromise as weakness, asking for help with negotiation was tantamount to admitting fundamental inadequacy. Rodriguez leaned forward with genuine sympathy.
Admiral, you've made tremendous progress over the past 5 years. The Helix Compact is one of the most stable regional alliances in the galaxy.
Because you've been holding our hand every step of the way, Crextar admitted bitterly.
But, what happens when humanity decides it's done babysitting the rest of us?
We need to learn to solve our own problems. It was a conversation Rodriguez had been having more and more frequently.
Across the galaxy, newly democratic governments were beginning to chafe at their dependence on human guidance.
They wanted to stand on their own, but centuries of authoritarian conditioning hadn't been erased overnight.
We're not your babysitters, Admiral, Rodriguez said gently. We're your teachers. And, eventually, students graduate. When? Crextar asked bluntly.
Rodriguez exchanged a look with Park before answering. It was the question they had all been dreading, because the answer was both simple and terrifying.
When you don't need us anymore.
After the conversation ended, Rodriguez and Park remained in the conference room, contemplating the implications of what had just been discussed. He's not the only one asking that question, Park observed.
I've been getting similar requests from military leaders across the galaxy. They want to know when the training wheels come off. And, honestly, Rodriguez replied, I'm not sure we know. How do you measure when an entire civilization has learned to be free?
It was Dr. Sarah Chen who provided the answer, though it came from an unexpected source. Chen had been working on New Kethery, helping the former corporate syndicate subjects establish their first democratic elections. The process had been challenging. Beings who had been conditioned to follow corporate directives for generations struggled with the concept of choosing their own leaders.
The breakthrough came when a young Kethery named Strix approached Chen with a question that changed everything. Dr. Chen, Strix had asked, why do the humans always have the final say in our decisions?
Chen had been puzzled.
What do you mean? We don't have final say in anything.
We just offer suggestions and help facilitate discussions. But everyone always asks what the humans think before making important choices, Strix explained. Even when we disagree among ourselves, we wait to hear the human opinion before deciding. The observation hit Chen like a physical blow. Without meaning to, humanity had created exactly the kind of dependency they had been fighting against. The galaxy's new democracies weren't truly free, they had simply replaced their old masters with gentler ones.
Chen's report sparked an emergency meeting of all human diplomatic personnel.
Representatives from across the galaxy gathered aboard the New Horizon to address what Dr. Martinez, humanity's chief of xenopsychology,
called the graduation problem. "We've created a galactic civilization of eternal children," Martinez explained to the assembled group. "They've learned to make decisions democratically, but they still look to us for validation and guidance. We've become the galaxy's parents." The solution they developed was as elegant as it was terrifying: humanity would withdraw. Not permanently, and not all at once, but gradually and systematically. Human advisors would stop offering opinions unless specifically asked for them 3 times. Human mediators would facilitate discussions but refuse to suggest solutions. Human teachers would answer questions with questions, forcing their students to find their own answers. "It's going to be messy," Rodriguez warned the gathered diplomats. "There will be mistakes, conflicts, even some failures. But that's how learning works." The withdrawal began on 12 test worlds, chosen for their relative stability and strong democratic institutions. Human advisors remained available but stopped participating in daily governance decisions. The results were immediate and dramatic. On New Kepler, a resource allocation dispute that would normally have been resolved with human mediation dragged on for weeks. The Keplers argued, debated, and grew increasingly frustrated without their usual human guidance. But, eventually, they found a solution that none of the humans would have suggested: a rotating system that satisfied all parties while strengthening inter-community cooperation. On Corvin Prime, former military leaders struggled to adapt their aggressive decision-making style to civilian governance. Without human mediators to smooth over cultural conflicts, heated arguments erupted regularly. But, slowly, they learned to listen to each other, to find common ground, and to make decisions based on consensus rather than dominance. The most dramatic change occurred on New Zephyr, where the formerly enslaved population had to navigate their first major crisis without human support. When a natural disaster struck their primary agricultural region, the traditional response would have been to request immediate human assistance. Instead, they organized their own relief efforts. Different communities contributed resources based on their abilities. Former corporate syndicate middle managers used their logistical skills to coordinate supply distribution. Military veterans from the old hegemony provided security and transportation. Even former void hunters contributed by using their knowledge of hostile environments to navigate disaster zones. The response wasn't as efficient as a human-coordinated effort would have been. It took longer, involved more arguments, and resulted in some resource waste. But it was theirs. 3 months into the withdrawal experiment, Captain Maria Santos received an urgent communication while stationed near the test worlds. A fleet of unidentified vessels had appeared at the edge of the galaxy, ships using technology that didn't match any known species. The first contact protocols developed during humanity's early exploration years kicked in immediately. Human naval forces moved to intercept while diplomatic teams prepared for potential negotiations. But, as Santos prepared to coordinate the response, something unprecedented happened. Admiral Kregstar's voice came over the communication channels, but he wasn't requesting human assistance. Instead, he was coordinating a joint response fleet composed of vessels from across the galaxy's new democratic governments. "Unknown vessels," Kregstar announced with his old military authority. "This is Admiral Kregstar of the Galactic Democratic Alliance. You have entered sovereign space without permission. State your intentions." Santos watched in amazement as the response fleet organized itself without human input. Corvin heavy cruisers took defensive positions while Selenite scout ships performed reconnaissance. Zephyrian vessels provided long-range communication support while Kepler ships coordinated supply lines. The unknown fleet, it turned out, belonged to a distant civilization that had been observing galactic politics from afar. They had come expecting to find the same imperial powers they had been monitoring for centuries. Instead, they found something they had never seen before: a unified response from dozens of species working together as equals. Dr. Rodriguez watched the first diplomatic meeting between the Galactic Alliance and the newcomers with tears in her eyes. The galaxy's representatives conducted themselves with dignity, wisdom, and confidence. They asked thoughtful questions, offered reasonable terms, and demonstrated the kind of mature diplomacy that came from experience and hard-won wisdom. At no point did they look to the humans for guidance. "I think," Rodriguez said quietly to Captain Park, "they're ready to graduate." The formal announcement came 6 months later at the dedication ceremony for the completed Galactic Cooperation Station. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered to witness humanity's formal transition from teachers to equal partners in galactic civilization. Ambassador Chenwei, now elderly but still sharp, stood before the assembled delegates to deliver humanity's final address as galactic mediators. 5 years ago, he began, we offered you a choice. The choice to determine your own destiny, to build societies based on cooperation rather than domination, to value freedom and dignity over power and control. He paused, looking out at the faces of beings from dozens of species who had learned to see themselves and each other as equals. Today, we offer you something even more precious, the chance to make that choice again, and again, and again, for as long as your civilizations endure. Not because we told you to, but because you understand why it matters. The applause that followed wasn't just polite diplomatic courtesy. It was the sound of an entire galaxy celebrating its own maturity. Years later, historians would mark this moment as the true end of the Age of Empires and the beginning of the Age of Cooperation. But, for the humans who had helped guide this transformation, it was something much simpler, the moment their students became their peers. The galaxy would face new challenges, make new mistakes, and find new ways to grow. But, it would do so as a community of equals, each species contributing its unique strengths while respecting the dignity and freedom of all others. Humanity had brought the galaxy to its knees not through conquest, but through the simple recognition that every sentient being deserved the chance to stand tall. And, in learning to help others find their footing, humanity had finally found its place in the cosmic community, not as rulers or teachers, but as partners in the endless journey toward a better tomorrow.